Good morning, and welcome to the 52nd Prix de West Invitational Art Exhibition and Sale. Here to begin today's program is the Curator of Ethnology for the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum, Dr. Eric Singleton.
Thank you. Good morning. As the nation's premier Western art exhibition and sale, Prix de West celebrates the American West through the many talented artists invited each year. Today's seminars will feature techniques, knowledge, and trends in Western fine art, and we'll hear personal experiences from a few artists as well. Because of the meaningful content contained in these seminars, we are pleased to offer them to the public, reaching an even larger audience. This tradition continues because of the generosity of the sponsors recognized on screen. If you see anyone wearing a white sponsor ribbon this weekend, please let them know how much you appreciate their support and contributions. Many people enjoy taking home a memento from Prix de West. Our commemorative Prix de West bolos and catalogs are available for purchase in the store Persimmon Hill, located near the front entry. While you're there, please take a few minutes to explore the trunk shows located right inside the entrance. Although we close at 4 p.m. today, Persimmon Hill will remain open until 6. Also tonight, beginning at 6 o'clock, society members, sponsors, and ticket holders are invited to attend the cocktail reception in the galleries. Guests will have the opportunity to mingle with the artists while viewing the exhibition. Tomorrow at noon, we'll announce the winner of the 2024 Prix de West Purchase Award. And tomorrow evening, our highly anticipated art sale will take place with cocktails in the gallery beginning at 5:30, where you can begin dropping ballots on your favorite pieces. Our celebration will continue with the presentation of awards, live auction, and dinner here in the Sam Noble Special Events Center. There's so much to look forward to this weekend, and we're excited to have you here. Our first seminar is titled No Severed Arm, Donald Teague's Western Illustrations. Donald Teague was an American genre painter whose realistic watercolors depicted both observed and imagined landscapes. He loved to portray cowboys and frontier towns of the Wild West with a dramatic narrative flair. And because he traveled widely, he also painted landscapes, architecture, boats, and figurative works all around the globe. Here to tell us more about the work of Donald Teague, please welcome his grandson, Scott Gale.
All right, well, good morning, everybody. I'm Scott, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak with you this morning about Donald Teague's Western Illustrations in this fabulous venue. Teague's remembered mostly for his fine art, but he was also one of our top illustrators and top Western illustrators during the second half of the golden era of illustration. So in today's talk, I'll start out by telling you a bit about my 3-year project with regard to his illustrations, tell you a little bit about his early life and early career. I'll show you a few illustrations from the 1920s and early 1930s, and we'll start getting into his best stuff around 1936. I've got about 75 slides. This is mostly a slideshow presentation, so saddle up. We're going to move pretty fast. So many of you may recall Donald Teague. As I've met more and more of you, I realize probably half of you recall Donald Teague. He exhibited at NAWA, the predecessor to Prix de West, beginning in 1973, the first show, and through the early 1980s. And he picked up a couple gold medals for watercolor and I think 3 silvers. I'll just share a couple works with you. So this is Appointment in Town from 1973, a full sheet watercolor, got a gold medal. And then in 1980, this is a much smaller work, 6x9, called Surprise Attack, that also picked up a gold medal. So mid-timers to the Prix de West may recall Linda Teague, Don's daughter, presenting here in 2014 about her dad. And at the end of that presentation, she gifted this illustration called Bugles in the Afternoon, #2, to the cowboy. And at the bottom right-hand portion of this became the basis for the Donald Teague Memorial Award, which is awarded here for best work on paper. Well, like the movie Poltergeist, they're back, only this time with a little bit of a twist. So Linda was my biologic mother. I was adopted out of the Teague family at birth in 1963 and raised by the Gale family, my parents, Joyce and Don. And so I never met Donald Teague. In fact, his death in 1991 led directly to meeting Linda, my birth mother, 3 weeks later via Donald's obituary. My mom, Joyce, was not an obituary reader by habit. She just happened to catch Teague's obituary in the San Jose Mercury and knew what it meant and cut it out and put it in her purse. And literally 10 days later, for the second time in my life, I had brought up with my mom, Joyce, about wanting to know more about my biologic background. And her jaw dropped, and she reached into her purse and pulled out a newspaper clipping and said, well, here, in light of what you just said, I want you to have this. I've been carrying this around for 10 days, not knowing what to do with it. But this is the obituary for your biologic grandfather. And if you read down, Linda, who lives in Los Angeles, is your birth mother. So if not for the courage and the selflessness of my mom, Joyce, and a great deal of luck, I may never have met Linda. So Linda and I went on to become great friends over the next 26 years, and she passed unexpectedly in late 2017. She should really still be here with us. And among many things, she was the keeper of the bulk of her dad's archive down in Los Angeles. The balance of it is here in the Dickinson Research Center. And so those archival materials passed to me, and they sat relatively undisturbed until COVID hit. So the COVID lockdown in California was long and hard, and pretty early on I was looking around for a good beefy project to sink my teeth into just to maintain my mental health and distract myself. And I figured I'd do a deep dive into Teague's career. So I got together with my biologic uncle, Ken Kitch, who lives in San Francisco. Ken was married to Linda's sister, Hillary. And we kind of went through the archive at a high level, and then I pulled everything back to Oakland and spent several months going through it with a fine-tooth comb, further organizing things. I scanned thousands of items. And really, I came to fully appreciate how talented the man was through that project, both as a fine artist and as an illustrator. And this was really my first exposure to his illustrations. And they really fascinated me. They were so good and yet kind of largely forgotten by time. And so once our library started opening up, I decided to do a super deep dive into his illustrations and try to find every one that I could. And so I spent a lot of quality time in California libraries, pretty much all brute force approach. To go find these illustrations. I found, I think, 525, give or take, stories that he illustrated, where each story might have 1 to 3 illustrations in it. And so for a few illustrators, like Norman Rockwell, there are complete lists of everything that they did. For most of the illustrators, there are partial lists, which are better than nothing. At least it gives you a sense of, who they worked for, magazine-wise and whatnot. But with the kind of project I had in mind, I just had to do it brute force. And once I identified Teague's illustrations, I scanned them and then pulled them into Photoshop and cleaned them up. My MO was to eliminate the story text, generally speaking. It was beyond my skills, anyways, to clean that up and make it still readable in Photoshop. And it was as I call it, a tedious but fascinating project. I, got exposed to all of our great illustrators in the 20s through the 50s by doing this brute force approach. And also I got to see the arc of Teague's career as an illustrator, his changing style, and also his Western story assignment load. When he started out, he might get 10, 15% of his stories were Westerns, and whereas in the last decade, it was over 50% for both the Post and Collier's were Westerns. So it's my privilege to share with you some of what I found, a good chunk of his Western illustrations today. But before I do that, let me tell you a little bit more about him. So Edwin Donald Teague was born in Brooklyn in 1897. And his father was also named Edwin, so Teague went by the name Donald from a young age, probably just to avoid confusion in the house. And Teague had a younger brother named John or Jack. Teague's mother, Frances, died at a young age when Teague was in his early teens, and from that point on, his dad raised the two boys alone. Teague was artistically gifted from a very young age. As he described it, from age 5, he always had a pencil in his hand, sketching, drawing. The image at the bottom left is a drawing of a frigate that he did at age 5. Teague attended Erasmus Hall High School in Brooklyn and continued to excel in art. The bottom middle image is a small work that he did as a freshman in high school that got first prize in his art class. So after finishing high school, he went to Art Students League for 2 years. He studied mostly under Bridgman and Demond, and after 2 years, he felt like he knew enough to go out and make his way as an artist in the world. He worked for 2 years in advertising initially and saved up some money, and in the summer of 1920, he and 2 Art Students League buddies decided to do a bicycling trip through Europe. So they landed in London, bought Raleigh bikes, crossed the Channel into Belgium, and then bicycled through Belgium and mostly through France for 3 months, painting and sketching. Must have been an incredible trip. World War II had just concluded a year prior. And when Teague landed in Cannes at the end of that trip, he came to the realization that the advertising world was not for him and that what he really wanted to be was a story illustrator. When he got back stateside, soon thereafter he met Dean Cornwell, who he became lifelong friends with. And Cornwell mentored him and gave him feedback, input in terms of putting together a series of samples that he could take around to art editors to try to gain work as an illustrator. And Teague often in his life credited Dean Cornwell as the single biggest influence on him as an illustrator. So the image at the bottom right is one of his samples that he used to gain work as an illustrator. It's a work that he did while he was on that bicycling trip in France of a French countryside scene. So Teague landed his first job as an illustrator in 1921, and his first couple years were rather humble and lean. As he described it, the occasional paycheck would stave off starvation for a short while. He landed his big break in early 1923, around the time that this photo was taken, when the art editor from the Saturday Evening Post paid him a visit in his studio and gave him his first assignment for the Saturday Evening Post. And as Teague described it, from that point on, he never really needed to worry about work. Teague did 66 story illustrations for the Post in the 1920s, 9 of which could be considered Westerns. At the time, the Post had W.H.D. Kerner in its stable of senior illustrators, and he was just a powerhouse Western illustrator. The man was a beast. I've seen a lot of, like, just week after week. And so the lion's share of the Western illustrations flowed to Kerner at that time. Teague was working in oil as an illustrator during this period, and his work from that period really doesn't give much of a sense of what's to come, but I'll share a few with you. So this is an illustration called Other People's Troubles from 1927, and you can see that Teague's already getting pretty good at depicting horses. He made a point of getting good at it. Most summers in the 20s, he spent in England following the horse shows around the countryside, sketching and painting. Another one I'll share with you, 1928, a story called A Man on Horseback. And the few summers that Teague didn't spend in England in the 20s, he typically spent on a ranch in Yampa, Colorado with his family. Teague's dad knew the ranch owner, and the two boys and dad would go spend summers there. And the ranch owner was an old-timer who grew up in the Old West. And oftentimes at night, he would entertain the Teagues with story after story about what life was like in the Old West. And it's through these experiences on that ranch that Teague really, this kid from Brooklyn, developed a deep and enduring love for the Old West. So Teague realized in his career that for better or for worse, illustrators are often considered second-tier artists relative to fine artists. And so he made a point of doing fine art during his career, pretty much right out of the gate. He first exhibited with the National Academy in 1928 and actually got his first of many awards with them that year, which included 5 first prizes for watercolor. He was inducted, or made an associate member in 1945 and a full member in 1948. He first exhibited with the American Watercolor Society in 1933 and got his first of many awards in 1944. He was inducted into the Society of Illustrators Hall of Fame in 1991, the year of his death, which to my mind is kind of late, given that he stopped illustrating effectively in 1956. I think there's an explanation for that, and we'll get into it a little bit further in the talk. When he died, the Los Angeles Times called him the Dean of American Watercolorists. And as Uncle Ken would say, not bad for a guy with a high school education. So around the time this illustration ran, in the summer of 1929, the winds of change started blowing upon Teague. The economic times were worsening. It was really the beginning of the Great Depression. And the Saturday Evening Post made the difficult decision to cut loose a lot of its junior illustrators, including Teague. So he had 13 stories that ran in the Post in 1929, only 2 in early 1930, and then he would not be seen in the Saturday Evening Post again until 1937. That summer, while following the English horse shows around the countryside, he decided to do something different. Instead of painting in oil, he decided to work in watercolor. And so he did about 100 watercolors, and he brought them back stateside with him and showed them to the art editor at Crowell Colliers, who liked what he saw and basically told Teague he'd give him all the work he could handle as he established himself as a watercolorist. So Crowell Colliers at the time was an empire. It had 3 main magazines, Collier's Weekly, which was the main competitor to the Post, The American, which was a monthly, and also Woman's Home Companion, also a monthly. And each magazine obviously is targeting different audiences. And so Crowell Colliers really got Teague through the Great Depression. So this is Teague's first illustration for Colliers. It's from September 1930, happened to be a Western by Alan LeMay. And the illustration seems very simple. And whether this is Teague still learning watercolor or whether it's just cost-cutting measures in the early part of the Great Depression, hard to say really. A lot of the illustrations in the early 1930s were very simple like this. And Teague didn't get a lot of Western assignments for Colliers in the first 5 or 6 years of working with them. At the time, Colliers had Harold von Schmidt in its stable, as well as a number of other capable Western illustrators, including John Ganem and Matt Clark. But this is one of the Western assignments that he got. I'll share another one with you here. King of the Big Bend. This one ran in 1932. Teague got, in my opinion, his big break as an illustrator, period, in 1936 for a Western 10-parter called Troubleshooter. So this one is running in Colliers, and it's about the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. And I'd like to take a moment to speak about the author, Ernest Haycox, just for a moment. So Haycox was a revered Western author back in the day. He's a bit forgotten today, but he wrote 24 novels, roughly 300 short stories, and he's probably best remembered for the short story Stage to Lordsburg, which was published in 1937. That was adapted 2 years later to become the basis for the movie Stagecoach, which launched John Wayne's career, directed by John Ford. Haycox died young at age 51. And it's my sense that had he lived a normal lifespan, he'd probably be right up there with Zane Grey, Louis L'Amour, and others in the uppermost pantheon of American Western writers. It turns out that Haycox and Teague made a great pairing. Haycox was mostly interested in the human drama of the Old West, and whereas Zane Grey might go on for pages about the landscape. And Teague, while he was a capable landscape artist, he really excelled at figures, horses, and town scenes, whether they were exteriors or interiors. And so once Troubleshooter ran, the two were paired together quite a bit subsequently. So this is the first installment, first illustration for Troubleshooter. And the whole series, the main illustrations were printed in black and white, probably as a cost-saving measure in the Great Depression. He did them as ink washes. Some of the ink drawings were printed in single color, like the blue one here. This is the third installment for Troubleshooter, and this is actually a photo of the original. And you can see the amount of work that's going into something like this. This is the fourth installment for Troubleshooter, and to me, what's cool about this is the first place in Teague's archive where process-related materials start showing up. And so I'd like to speak for a moment about Teague's process as I understand it. So I'm a physician, semi-retired now, and so the process stuff to me is fascinating. It gives insights into how he did what he did. So he'd get a story typically months prior to publication. And as he became a senior illustrator, he was given a pretty free hand for each installment to determine what moments to illustrate, how to illustrate them. And he'd start out by doing these simple little sketches, like this one is 1 by 3 inches. And he might do dozens of these. I've read up to 60. And he's just doing basic forms, light and dark, until he hit upon the layout that he wanted. His MO was to destroy these once he finished a project, because everything flowed from these little sketches, and he felt like it would be too much of a temptation to him to have these in his archive, that he might be tempted to repeat himself in a subsequent assignment. So only 3 of these exist, and this is one of them. So once he worked out a preliminary sketch like this, he'd do a preliminary illustration and send that back to the art editor for feedback. And once he got the feedback, he'd go to work on the final illustration, at which point he'd hire models, obtain costumes, props, rolling stock if needed, whatever was needed to complete the final illustration. And then he used photography with his main models, mostly to capture detail information, like clothing folds and shadowing effects and whatnot. Then he'd do a pencil drawing of the final illustration, and then fill that in with watercolor, maybe a little gouache, or do it mostly in gouache, and send that in for publication. It would run several weeks later. Meanwhile, he's off to the next assignment. And I've included a fair amount of process-related material in the presentation from here on out. So this is the final installment for Troubleshooter, and this is the meeting of the Central and Pacific Union Railroads at Promontory Summit. And he probably did this from a historic photo, but you can just see the amount of detail and information that he's putting into something like this. So in 1937, the winds of change blew upon Teague again, this time more favorably. The economic circumstances were improving. The Post brought him back on board as an illustrator. He's continuing to work for Crowell Colliers. And so his professional and financial situation is improving, and he figured this would be a good time to date and marry. So he married Verna Timmons, who was the daughter of Harry Timmons, who was a powerhouse commercial and then story illustrator himself. They had a small wedding in Connecticut in 1937. And what's really cool is everybody that attended rather, signed the back of the marriage certificate. And it's kind of a who's who of illustrators from back in the day. So in attendance, it included C.C. or Ted Beale, who among other things was a prolific cover artist for Colliers back in the 30s and early 40s. John Falter, who was working commercially at the time, but went on to become one of the Post's preeminent cover artists. Meade Schaefer was doing story illustrations, and I think covers by that time for the Post. His World War II covers are unbelievable. The next gentleman really needs no introduction. Rockwell served as an usher at the wedding. And so Teague and Rockwell became friends in the 1920s and remained lifelong friends. The next gentleman in illustration circles really needs no introduction. Al Parker invented a whole genre of illustration called glamour illustration. I mentioned Harry Timmons already. Roy Spreeder was a powerhouse commercial illustrator. mostly remembered for his ads for Campbell's Soup, Bon-Ami, and Camay Soap. And then the last gentleman needs no introduction in these parts. Both Tom and his wife attended the wedding, and Teague, it turns out, was an early mentor to Tom as he was establishing himself as an illustrator. So after the Teagues married, they moved clear across country to Los Angeles, to Encino specifically, where Teague's dad and brother had moved a year previously. And once Teague landed in Los Angeles, he soon thereafter rekindled a number of art student league friendships, including 2 with classmates who are now working as art directors in the movie industry. And through those 2 friendships, it really opened up a whole new world to Teague, that of Hollywood. And the art directors allowed Teague to have access to Western movie sets and, movie sets in general. As long as he stayed out of the way, he could photograph and sketch and whatnot. He met a lot of the actors. He had access to all of Hollywood's machinery in terms of costumes and rolling stock and props and whatnot. They even let him into the studio archives to access stills from older movies. And so perhaps counterintuitively, this Hollywood influence really helped Teague to up his game as an illustrator. You might think, Hollywood, right? But they were actually real sticklers for accuracy. They had to get everything right in the movies, otherwise they'd get called out on it. And likewise, Teague was a real stickler for accuracy and detail, because he too, if he got anything wrong in an illustration, he would get called out on it. And so one starts to see the Hollywood influence in Teague's Western illustrations soon after he moved there. The next one I'll share with you is from 1939, a story called Saddle and Ride. This is an 8-parter, again by Ernest Haycox. And so this is the 3rd installment. And so the backdrop for this is a Hollywood movie set. Teague's flipped it to a nocturne and then populated it with the horses and folks and whatnot in it. This is the 4th installment for Saddle and Ride, and so the larger image to the right is the main illustration, where the backdrop, again, is a Hollywood movie set. He's flipped it to a nocturne and black and white. The smaller blue image is another nocturne, where the backdrop, again, is a Hollywood movie set, and then he's populated it with the horses and people and carriage and whatnot in the fore and midground. And then this is the final installment for Saddle and Ride, and so the smaller black and white photo is from his archive, and then in the final illustration you can see he's kind of flipped things around a little bit, but you can make out the horseshoe with blacksmith on it and the carriage in the background and whatnot. So the next illustration I'll share with you is a story called Gunsmoke that ran in 1940, and to me, people could disagree with me, but I consider this the first one in the Westerns that it's in his mature style, really. And so the backdrop for this one, again, is a Hollywood movie set, and I just love his window treatment in this one. This is really cool. So in 1941, this is Teague's entry into the National Academy of Design exhibit. It's called New Hall, California. And it's a fine art painting of a Hollywood movie set. So you can see the power lines in the foreground. There's guys off to the right hauling stuff away. And this one didn't win an award with the National Academy, but it just speaks to how important access to the Western movie sets was to Teague in terms of his illustration career. So the next story I'll share with you is called Trail Town. This one ran in Collier's 1941. And so this is the first installment, first page, and I just love this one. The assemblage of gentlemen up top, having a parley, and the dead guy with the gun down at the bottom and the cards strewn around. Really cool. This is also the first installment, second page, and so the final illustration is over to the right, obviously. And then from his archive, this is a photo of his female model that he used in full period costume and headdress, where he's blocked off the background so he can get a full silhouette on her. This is the second installment for Trail Town, and it's a lovely nocturnal scene, black and white, a lot of stuff going on in this one. And it reminds me of one of Uncle Ken's favorite sayings, which is, nobody could paint a horse's rear end better than Donald Teague. So the last one from this story I'll share with you is the 5th installment. And so the story has a dragging scene in it, and I'm imagining that Teague just used a Hollywood movie still to create the two guys in the foreground, and then a Hollywood movie set for the background where he's flipped it to a nocturne again. So the next story I'll share with you is called Dispatch to the General, and this one ran in Collier's in early 1942. This is another Haycock story, and I love this one also with the two fellows in the foreground and then the background and the landscape and the color and everything. So this is his first Western that ran with the Post since he came back. So it's been 5-6 years since he returned, and this is his first Western assignment. A story called Horses at Broken Bow. It ran in May of 1942, and he's done a lovely ranch scene here. And so I find it kind of odd. He's killing it with these Westerns over with Collier's, but this is the first Western assignment that he gets back with the Post. And I think part of what was going on is W.H.D. Kerner retired in 1936, and soon thereafter the Post wooed Harold von Schmidt over from Collier's, and so the vast majority of the Westerns were flowing to von Schmidt initially. But once this one ran, a lot more Westerns started flowing Teague's way from the Post. So this is a really interesting illustration. In late 1941, Teague got an ultimatum from the art editor for the Saturday Evening Post. He did not like it that Teague was working for Collier's, the main competitor, and so Teague was basically told, choose your side. And he slept on it, and he said, well, what if I continue to work for Collier's under a pseudonym? And both of the art editors agreed to that deal. And so he picked Edwin Dawes as his pseudonym. And Teague's dad's full name was Edwin Dawes Teague, and Teague's legal first name was Edwin. So it's kind of a double inside family joke in terms of this pseudonym. But basically, from here on out, Teague disappears from Collier's and is replaced by Edwin Dawes. And very few people knew that Edwin Dawes was actually Donald Teague. The art editors obviously knew it. I'm sure some of his close friends knew it. But the world at large did not know. So anyways, Teague disappears. He's replaced by Edwin Dawes, and the new guy comes out guns a-blazing here with this fabulous, nocturnal carriage scene with the, lovely woman descending the stair. And speaking of guns a-blazing, the original for this sold with Heritage a couple months ago, and I was bidding on it out in California via the internet. I really wanted to get this one back into Teague's archive. And somebody in the audience was bidding on it, and as the price approached 5 times the upper estimate, I was like, boy, this person is determined, and they're carrying pretty big iron. I got to walk away from this one. So I let her go. So whoever got it, take good care of her. She's real important in terms of Teague's history. So this is the 5th installment for Action by Night. Lovely equine scene. And then I'll share with you the final installment for Action by Night, a fabulous gunfight scene. And so this ran in black and white. The original was actually done in color, the smaller image off to the left there. And why Collier's chose to go with black and white on this, I don't know. I will say that oftentimes with these long serials, they would just do black and white for the last few illustrations just to save some money. I think they figured people were either reading the story by that point or they weren't, and so why spend more money on color to lure anybody in? So Teague's next major Western assignment was for a story called Bugles in the Afternoon. This one is another Haycock story. It ran in 1943 in the Saturday Evening Post. And so this is the first installment, first page illustration in the middle. And one thing that's cool about this one is that in 1946, an author named Ernest Watson put out a book called 40 Illustrators and How They Work. And Teague was one of the 40 illustrators that was featured in this book. And there's a whole page of pencil sketches that Teague did related to the creation of this final illustration. So it just shows you the kind of work that he put in on something like this. It's not like he would just sit down and knock something like this out. So this is also first installment, page 2. We've seen this one before. And this is the second installment, page 1, over to the right. And you can tell Teague's pulling out all the stops on this story. If the image looks vaguely familiar, it's because 3 decades later, Teague repurposed the same Western movie set to create Appointment in Town. He's shifted everything over to the right now. You have the pensive and determined sheriff coming solo through town to his appointment, where presumably some justice is going to be laid down. And then I'll share with you also the 7th installment from Bugles. And one of the companies of I should have mentioned. So the story is, it's a love triangle set against the backdrop of Custer's impending last stand against the Sioux. And so they're in the heat of it now. And one of the companies is taking a lot of heat, a lot of incoming, and it's just total mayhem. So this is a photo from early 1944 of the Teague family in Encino. So left to right, you have Verna, younger daughter Hillary, then Linda, my biologic mother, and Donald. And this next slide gives you a sense of the character of the Encino property back in the 40s at times. At the top left, that's Teague's studio out back. They had a very deep lot. And about a year after moving there, Teague and his brother Jack built that studio so he could have some separation and really concentrate on his work. Bottom left is Teague with his Graflex camera. The top middle is him in his house with part of his gun collection. He had 30, 40 guns that he used as props for illustration and then fine art purposes. And then the remainder of the images are various bad hombres that are inhabiting the Teague property, where he's taken these photos and then using this to help create illustrations. The one that's more sepia colored at the bottom is his brother Jack, who Teague used a lot as a male model, mostly for non-Westerns, but this one is for a Western. So next I'll share a story or an illustration with you from 1944 for a short story called And Call It Luck. So this is ran in Collier's, and a lovely nocturne. And I just love, the lighting effects with this one, with the silhouette on the fellow over to the right, and then also the horse's breath over to the right. Teague's next major Western assignment was for a story called Canyon Passage, again by Haycox. This one ran in 1945 in the Post, and this is a really cool story about Old Oregon. And I'll share a couple illustrations with you. So this is the second installment, a lovely equine scene. And Uncle Ken's saying is certainly true here with this one as well, about the horse's rear ends. And then this is the final installment for Canyon Passage. And I just love this one, the sense of motion and determination with the 3 fellows jumping over the log. And the still photo is, it shows the lengths Teague would go to sometimes to create the photos that would help him make an illustration like this. So he's in his studio, he's got a hobby horse, he's put a log over it, he's got his model in full costume with the pistol coming over the top. We can't see the lighting, but it's coming in from up above, and really cool. So the next illustration I'll share with you is from Collier's again, 1946, a story called The Hard Decision. And so the finished illustration is over to the right, a couple of photos from his archive that he used to help create this illustration are over to the left. And one thing, we kind of lose track of how important the magazines were back in this period. So both Collier's and the Post, they had circulations of between 3 and 4 million. And, TV was just in its infancy back then. And so people didn't have the ways to get information and entertainment back then the way that we do today. And how many hands touched each copy that went out? Hard to say, really. How many eyeballs saw these illustrations? Hard to say. But the impact was impressive when these went out. So Teague's next major Western assignment was for a story called Fiddlefoot. This one also ran in the Post in 1946. and a 7-parter. I'll share a couple illustrations with you. This is one of my favorite Teague illustrations, period. So we've got the boss and the tub over there to the left, his tall visitor in the center, and then the boss's guard man over there to the right with what looks to be a bit of an itchy trigger finger. And the photo to the left, again, just shows the creativity involved in making these photos. So he's got the fake tub, he's got the boss with the cigar in there, the lighting from up above. He's blocked off his bookcase or his book collection so he can get a silhouette on the boss. And this is the 4th installment from Fiddlefoot, another lovely nocturnal scene with the 5 gentlemen around the lantern hatching up a plan. So Teague's next major Western assignment was also with Collier's 1947 5-parter called Sweetwater. And I'll share a couple illustrations from that one with you. This is the first installment, pages 2 and 3. It's my second favorite Teague saloon fight scene. So I love the composition, the color, and also how the barkeep is like in suspended animation pouring the drink. He can't quite believe what he's seeing going down. And this is the 4th installment, and there's a lot going on in this. So somebody's taken a shot at the fellow that's fallen off the horse. He's missed the fellow, but he hit the horse clean between the eyes, so the horse is gone. And this guy's trying to bail out of the horse before he gets trapped underneath it. Pretty amazing. So the next one I'll share with you is another Haycock's story called On Bake Oven Grade. This one ran in Collier's in 1948, and quite a bit going on in this one also. So we have the fight over to the right, over the young lady in the middle, the carriage, the horses, and around the time that this one was published, just to speak to how few people knew that Dawes was Teague, Edwin Dawes got an invitation. He got an invitation from the president of the Society of Illustrators to join the organization. And Dawes politely declined, citing the huge travel distance from California would just make it impossible for Dawes to meaningfully participate in the organization. Meanwhile, Teague continued to participate in the organization. So Teague's next major Western assignment was a story called Rustler's Range. This was a 7-parter in the Saturday Evening Post that ran in 1949, and I'll share a couple illustrations with you. This is the first installment, first page, and just a lovely scene with a lot of information in the background. And then a couple still photos from his archive that he used to help make this. So the fellow with the rifle, he's changed over to salt and pepper hair in the final illustration. And then for the fellow with his hand up, he's moved inside so he can get the lighting just how he wants it. And then this one is the 5th installment for Rustler's Range. I just love this one as well, with the horses at the gallop. And I love the right-hand portion of this one in particular, where you get the sense of the motion, that the horses are swaying, the riders are swaying, just amazing. So after Rustler's Range was published, there was a drop-off in Teague's illustration output for 12 to 18 months. Life in Encino was getting a little too hectic for the Teagues. What started out as kind of a rural environment, after World War II was over, there was a lot of homes going in. It was rapidly becoming a suburb of Los Angeles, and so it was just a bit too much for them. So they looked as far north as Marin before deciding that Carmel looked like a good fit for them. So they moved to Carmel in 1949, initially rented a house for a year, confirmed that it was a good fit, and then decided to build a home. So they bought a lot and built this home, largely home built, all for the princely sum of $26,000. And so the bottom right image, the bottommost image on the left is where the house is closer to completion, and you can notice the northern-facing skylight there. So this was Teague's library as well as his initial studio for the first 5 years after the house was completed. Eventually in 1956, he built a separate structure out back that served as his studio from '56 until he stopped working as an artist. And then the photo of him to the right is him working in his original studio here. So the next illustration I'll share with you actually comes from Esquire. Teague had a brief run with Esquire in 1951 and '52. Why, I don't know exactly. He didn't need the money. He's still working for Crowell Colliers and the Post. I suspect that the layouts really tempted him because they were very generous for the illustrators. At any rate, his first story for Esquire was a Western called Point of Justice, and just an amazing scene where each of these guys is looking off in a different direction, trying to figure out which way trouble's coming. And the two photos over to the left are of models that he used to help create the composite illustration over to the right. The next one I'll share with you is also from Esquire, a story called Posse that ran in June of 1951, and just another gorgeous illustration. And I laugh at these because it's like the story has really taken backseat to the illustration. The next one I'll share with you ran in Collier's 1951, a story called The Richest Vein. And so the illustration over to the right, a lovely town scene, and then a still photo from his archive of the female model that he used to help create this illustration. I'll share another one with Esquire with you next, called Uprising. This one ran in January 1952, and again, just gorgeous scene, and the story is like a afterthought on these first two pages. So the next one I'll share is also from Collier's, a story called Keturah Remsburg, which ran in early 1952 also. This one was written by Jack Schaefer, who's mostly remembered for writing Shane, which was published in 1949. So Schaefer's relatively fresh off the success of Shane when he's writing this one. And what's cool about this one is the preliminary illustration for it is in his archive, so that's the smaller image to the left, and then the finished illustration is over to the right. And to me, it's amazing the amount of work that's going into a preliminary illustration like this. And then also just to do the compare-contrast, where the overall composition is the same, but he's changed up a lot of elements in the final illustration. The color of the woman's dress, her stance, certain aspects of the gentleman, and certain aspects of the carriage and the landscape and whatnot. So Teague's next major Western assignment came with Collier's, a story called Saddle by Starlight. This one also ran in 1952, and I'll share a couple illustrations with you from this one. This is my favorite Teague saloon fight scene, where the conversation is not going well, and the one fellow's decided to engage in a little Old West alternative dispute resolution with the other fellow. I just clocked him, and all eyes are on the action. And the photo to the left just cracks me up every time I look at it. It just shows the lengths to which he'd go to, create the photos that would help him with his illustrations. So there's two hobby horses, there's boards laid over him, he's got his model falling backwards onto the boards. Pretty cool. So this is the sixth installment for Saddle by Starlight. So the fellow that's down has just been shot, and the fellow in the left is providing some cover. The black and white photo is the model that Teague used for this illustration. And that model's an interesting fellow. His name is Jack, or J.N. Swanson. So within a year of moving to Carmel, Swanson and Teague met, and they hit it off great. They loved each other. They'd sketch horses together often. And it turned out that Swanson was a perfect male model. He was young, handsome, tall, good on a horse. And so Swanson actually became Teague's main male model for the last 5 years of his career. Mostly in Westerns, but some non-Westerns as well. So the next one I'll share with you is called The Angle of a Bullet. This one ran in Collier's in 1952. A lovely interior scene, looks like it's an adobe, and with a lot of period detail in it. And so Jack Swanson was the male model for this, and Teague's wife Verna was actually the female model. Next, I'll share one of my favorite Teague illustrations, period, with you. This is the second installment of a story called Under the Burning Sky. And this one ran in 1953, so it's a nocturne, a stampede scene. We've got the cowboy out front trying to get control of things. And the model for this, you guessed it, Jack Swanson on one of his many horses out in Carmel Valley. The next one I'll share with you is Command. This one also ran in Collier's, also 1953. So it looks like these two guys are fighting, but actually the guy on top has just pulled his colleague down to avoid getting shot by Apache. And so the male model for the guy on top, Jack Swanson. Well, this brings us to the title slide for my talk this morning. This is the preliminary illustration for the first installment of a story called The Avenging Texans, written by Alan LeMay. And so this was sent back east to the art editor, and his only comment back to Teague was, no severed arm. And figured that wouldn't go down too well with some of the readership. So this is what actually ran in the Post. And kind of a cool story. So as I was getting more into Teague's Westerns, I figured, you know, I should read a number of Western novels just to get more of a sense of the history and the flavor of the time. And I read a load of them. And one of them that I read was The Searchers by Alan LeMay. And I'm reading The Searchers, and I'm reading about Amos and Martin and the Edwards family, Martha, Debbie. And I'm like, man, where have I read this before? So I pulled up my scans of The Avenging Texans, and The Avenging Texans was the serialized name for The Searchers. And I'm like, oh my God, Teague illustrated The Searchers, which of course, you know, 2 years later became one of our great all-time Western movies with John Wayne, directed by John Ford again, and one of our great American movies, period, for that matter. So The Avenging Texans, if anybody's, or I should say The Searchers, if anybody's read it, it's rather unrelenting and pretty no-holds-barred. This is the third page from the first installment. So a Comanche is about to snatch Debbie and abduct her. And, you know, one wonders if a story like this could get published today, given the, you know, how it was written and illustrated, given our changing sensibilities. But it was, you know, different times back then. So the models for this, Teague used his younger daughter Hillary to model for as Debbie. And one thing that's really cool about that is the dress she's wearing is the dress that Vivian Leigh wore in Gone with the Wind for the Burning of Atlanta sequence. When the movie was over, the art editor gifted that dress to Teague to use for illustration purposes. And then the gentleman who's modeling as the Comanche, you guessed it, Jack Swanson. So this is the second installment for The Avenging Texans, you know, brutal fight scene. And then I'll share with you the fifth installment, you know, another gorgeous illustration. So we have the Texas Rangers at the gallop coming in from the right, and the Comanche masked off in the distance to the left. The next story I'll share with you is a story called A Killer Came to Town. This one ran in the Post also, 1955 now, and this was a two-parter. So this is the first installment. Final illustration is over to the right, and then the preliminary illustration is in his archive. That's the smaller image over to the left. And to me, what's cool about this one is oftentimes they had working titles for these stories when Teague would be doing his work. So the working title on this one was The Bully of the Town, and then they changed it to the much cooler title, A Killer Came to Town, when it actually ran. So this is the second installment for A Killer Came to Town, so an impending saloon duel scene. And so the final illustration is over to the right. The preliminary illustration is bottom left, and that's still in the family. And then a black and white photo of the backdrop that Teague used for this one is above that. And if anybody's ever out in the Monterey Peninsula, there's a cool little town called San Juan Bautista, not far away. There's a gorgeous mission there. There's also a historic hotel and saloon called the Plaza Hotel and Saloon. And the Plaza Saloon is what he used as the backdrop for this illustration. And if you go there today, it pretty much looks the same as it does in that photo there. Nothing's changed. So Teague's last major Western illustration assignment came for a two-part story called The Keeneland. This one ran in Collier's in 1956, written again by Jack Schaefer. And so this is the first installment illustration. And to me, what's cool about this one is my bio mom, Linda, served as the model for both of the ladies. And the left-hand portion of this illustration, I've put one of the photos up here. And then this is the second installment, a lovely vignette scene. So Collier's went under at the end of 1956, and at that time, Teague essentially resigned as an illustrator and focused on fine art from that point onward. He did do a couple illustrations for True magazine in 1958, I think just nostalgically more than anything else, but when Collier's went under, that was it for Teague in terms of illustrating. So this is from a slide in the Teague archive. He was working on a Western when Collier's went under called Evie, and so I don't know what happened to the original preliminary illustration. All that remains is this slide. And it's kind of cool because in the bottom left, he's signed it both Edwin Dawes as well as Donald Teague, perhaps as a commentary on his last 15 years working with Collier's. So in conclusion, it's been a great pleasure to be with you this morning. And Donald Teague was one of our great illustrators and great Western illustrators working in the second half of the golden era of illustration. He was expert at depicting horses, a real stickler for accuracy and detail. I've spoken about the perhaps counterintuitive positive influence of the Hollywood exposure in terms of his career as an illustrator, and that, you know, to my mind, he developed his signature style shortly thereafter. Edwin Dawes. So Teague always downplayed, what I've read, the Edwin Dawes thing. He'd laugh it off. To me, it's kind of a big deal. His last 15 years as an illustrator for Collier's, he's working under a pseudonym, and nobody knew that Dawes was Teague. And so I think that in large part explains why he was inducted into the Society of Illustrators Hall of Fame so late in life, the year of his death. And, there's a lot of injustices in this world, aren't there? And in the big picture, this is a relatively minor one. But hopefully today's talk has helped to kind of, set things straight in terms of the complete impact of Teague's career as a Western illustrator. If you've enjoyed my talk this morning, I'd invite you to go to a non-commercial website I have going for Teague called Donald Teague NA for National Academy. I have all of these images as well as loads more illustrations, lots of great Western illustrations on there. And a week ago, just for you guys, I posted the great majority of his Western fine art there also. So if you've enjoyed the talk, feel free to have a look. So, not yet. So finally, I want to say a few muchas gracias to some folks. First of all, to Randall or Randy Dutra, who exhibits here. He's exhibiting this year. He's a good friend of mine, and he saw what I was up to last year with these illustrations and saw a potential Prix de West talk in it and made the introductions here. Secondly, to Susan Patterson and her gang for saying yes. Thirdly, to the various libraries out in California that I was able to utilize for this project, who've maintained our great legacy magazines in fine form for the most part. The digitization of these magazines is all great, but for the kind of project I did, there's no substitute for getting hands-on physical paper, really. And then finally, I want to say thanks to my wife, Nina, out in California, who tolerated my 3-year project here, which at times bordered on obsession, really, honestly. So with that, I'm up against the time constraints here, but I'll hang out up here during the intermission if anybody has any questions. And if you see me around the Cowboy today or tomorrow, feel free to, come up and we can chat. Thank you.